Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Pereira. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Chinese President Xi Jinping held their first bilateral meeting since the Doklam standoff. Their meeting at the BRICS summit in China's port city of Xiamen came just days after the two countries resolved the almost 3-month-long border dispute. According to Chinese state media, Xi told Modi that healthy, stable China-India ties were necessary. Prime Minister Modi congratulated Xi on a very successful execution of the 3-day BRICS summit in a show of conciliatory support between the two leaders. On this edition of The Big Picture, we'll discuss the takeaways from the 2017 BRICS summit. Joining me on the program today are Jabinti Jacob, Fellow, Institute of Chinese Studies, Delhi. Also joining me on the program, Sushant Sareen, Strategic Affairs expert, and S.R. Tayal, former diplomat. Thank you so much to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. Ambassador Tayal, I'd like to begin with you. What are the takeaways, really, do you think, from an India's point of view at BRICS 2017?
If we look at it from India's point of view, I think we can have many satisfactions. One is that, of course, terrorism has been mentioned very strongly, and this is an advance from the Goa declaration. And in Goa, our Prime Minister had to really make a pitch for anti-terrorist sentiments, but the statement was not very strong. But here, whatever we wanted is there. The organizations have been named, which are based in Pakistan. And such a statement getting issued from Chinese territory, I think, is a big plus for us. Second, where I see India's invisible hand is that 5 guests were invited by China, special guests outside BRICS. And they are Thailand, Mexico, Egypt, Guinea and Tajikistan. Why is Pakistan not there? If China itself does not invite Pakistan, which is their bosom friend, which is their best friend in the neighborhood, why? And if they wanted to invite, were we able to prevail upon China not to invite Pakistan? And the third thing, where I think our views prevailed was on BRI. In the entire declaration, Xiamen declaration, there is no mention of Belt and Road Initiative, and the only country which has strong reservations on BRI are India and Bhutan. And it was not mentioned there, which is a great matter of satisfaction for us. And I will also say that in his plenary statement, President Xi Jinping said that BRI is not a tool to advance a geopolitical agenda, but a platform for practical cooperation. So he took India's reservations on board. The Chinese as a host accommodated India's reservations. I think it is a very good takeaway for us and perhaps good for India-China bilateral relations also as we go forward.
You know, Sushant Sareen, I'd like to bring you into the picture now. You know, as far as naming some of the Pakistani-based terror outfits are concerned, the Pakistani media has reacted to that. They've said that Chinese have let them down. Does that really mean anything?
Well, I think to the extent that the Pakistanis are spooked by the declaration, I think is a matter of great satisfaction to us. But in real terms, what does it mean? I think we'll have to wait and see whether the Chinese position on, for example, Masood Azhar changes when the time comes for the inclusion of his name in the 1267 list. The Chinese have been resisting so far. So if that position changes, and because they have agreed to references to the Jaish-e-Mohammed in this particular declaration, it becomes even more difficult for them to keep resisting the chief of a terrorist organization from being designated as an international terrorist. So I think that incongruity cannot be carried out indefinitely, and even the Chinese are realizing, and the grapevine in Pakistan is that the Chinese are telling the Pakistanis that, you know, it's becoming more and more difficult for them to keep this technical hold going on. It might happen a couple of more times, but it cannot be done indefinitely.
Is that the next logical step then? Is that the next logical step?
For the Pakistanis who... Well, that would be, but I think what is even more important is that the fact that there has been also references to organizations like the Taliban and the Haqqani network, and a very strong statement in favor of the Afghan government and the Afghan National Security Forces and their fight against terrorism, and naming both, like I said, the Haqqani network and the Taliban, which are pets of Pakistan and with which even the Russians and the Chinese have been flirting. Now, when you add the whole thing together, does this mean or does this indicate that there is a major shift in the Chinese position? I think we'll have to wait and see. It's still early days yet.
Okay.
I think it would be rather premature and presumptuous of us to think that merely in this declaration the Chinese are signaling a major and a tectonic shift in their policy towards Pakistan. I don't think that is likely to happen anytime soon, but perhaps we've managed to push the envelope a little bit, and to that extent I think that's good as far as Indian diplomacy is concerned.
Okay, still early days. We'll have to wait and see what really happens on the ground there in Pakistan is what you're suggesting. So we'll wait and see. In the meantime, let me bring in Jabin Jacob into the picture. The bilateral Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Did you think that that went on well in spite of, just coming out of this almost 3-month-long tense standoff between the two nations?
Well, I think it's a function of diplomacy to make sure that these meetings go off well, that they look good despite whatever else tensions might exist. Now, having said that, just because a meeting appears to have gone off good and well doesn't mean that there aren't other problems in the relationship or that there isn't a problem around the corner. I mean, we had for what is to all appearances, a great meeting in Astana, and we had Doklam right after. So let's not go by appearances. Let's wait and watch and be prepared for whatever comes our way. Just to take on the question of this issue of the declaration of these terrorist groups in the BRICS declaration, I think again, as Mr. Sareen said, I think I go with his view that we shouldn't read too much into it. The Chinese way of diplomacy is to actually make us really fight very hard for these simple, what to the rest of the world are extremely reasonable steps to take. So I think they have taken their own sweet time to get to this stage.
So are you suggesting the path ahead is going to be a difficult one then?
Yeah, I think, as Mr. Sareen said, that the Chinese cannot keep up this technical hold for too long without looking very bad in the process. It just doesn't make sense for them. Plus, they also need to put pressure on the Pakistanis. Now, so that's one side of the picture. The other side is, remember that the Chinese are actually encouraging talks between the Taliban, the same Taliban that they have declared as, anathema in this declaration. They are also encouraging talks between the Afghan government and the Taliban. So they are doing, they are playing both sides of the game. So let us, wait and watch how the Chinese take this forward.
Okay. Treacherous road ahead, but India will have to play a tough balancing act, is what you're suggesting. Supamoy Bhattacharya, welcome to the program. Business editor of the consulting editor, I beg your pardon, of the Business Standard, joins us on the program now. Supamoy, as far as the road ahead for India and China are concerned, what are the areas that we can work together to try and improve the relationship as has been suggested by the heads of states of both the countries?
In terms of improving, there is a huge amount of things. The river water sharing is one of those most classic ones. This year, for instance, when this Doklam thing was at its height, a simple thing like the regular sharing of river water data, which a riparian state like India would need, even that fell into a question of the two countries' strategic stay-off. There are plenty of, and in terms of India-China connections on building on trade, the issue of entry of some of the issues that we have almost forgotten for a long time, which is the access of Indian pharmaceutical companies into India, into China, the issue of IT trade. There are so many of those. The point is that, right now India and China will be facing each other, or rather will be meeting each other regularly. And the big point of this sort of a meeting is that you'll never really be meeting at a perfectly, what I might call, peaceful position. There would be something or other music playing in the background. And it's a question of Indian government able to see that what are the short-term things or whether the medium-term things which can be handled and which need to be taken forward despite all the sort of differences that would keep on coming. Because India, China, to expect that the countries would actually be finding a position where there are no discordant noises. I think that era is now totally clearly behind us. It's a time when both the countries have to accept that there would be those differences, and within that try to see what are the immediate necessities in any particular sector and focus on the deliverables there. If
Sure.
that is looked at, then there would be a lot of advantages which both countries can secure from each other.
Fair enough. Ambassador, have we just witnessed a resetting of ties between India and China, or is it too early to make that assessment as of now?
It's too early. In Foreign Secretary Jaishankar's briefing, he made 2-3 very important points. He said that the leaders decided that the relationship will be forward-looking. That means they will not dwell too much on the past. Then he said that it was a very constructive discussion on where the relationship should be headed. That means they are looking at future where it should be headed. And the third point, that peace and tranquility at the border is a prerequisite. He used the word prerequisite for this relationship to go forward. So very clearly it has been told to China that you must maintain peace and tranquility at the border, otherwise whatever economy, etc., the compartmentalization, okay, border you can compartmentalize. Border you can talk later and say that all right, we will keep on talking, but the rest of the relationship will be normalized. But if Doklam type incidents take place, then relationship cannot be normal. I think that message has gone. Here in this context, the China experts are here. I would like to say that some foreign analysts I have been talking to, they have said that is there some dissonance between the PLA and Xi Jinping. You will remember 2015 when Xi Jinping was here, there was some incident in Dapsang or somewhere else. And all this, the road construction, was it with the full knowledge and approval of Xi Jinping or not? That is for our China experts to
Indeed,
indicate.
indeed. Sushant Sareen, do you want to add something to that? The ambassador is suggesting that maybe the PLA and Xi Jinping, the president of China, are not on the same page. Are you picking up the same kind of signals?
Well, there is some talk of that. Some of the recent changes which have been made in the top brass of the Chinese army, and Xi Jinping getting his own people in, some senior officers have been replaced, especially the guy who was in charge of the Tibet area. So there are some indications that some kind of a tussle might be on. Now, in a very opaque system like the Chinese system, how relevant is this to what has been happening vis-a-vis India? I think, it's anybody's guess. But nevertheless, I think to just look at what has happened between India and China in the recent past from the prism of what is the interplay of forces within China, I think wouldn't exactly be the right way to go about it. Because let's face it, there are some very serious issues between the two countries. We need to try and resolve those, but just India wanting to resolve those are not going to help. The Chinese have to be equally keen to push ahead with this relationship and enter into a very cooperative sort of an arrangement with India, which necessarily seem to be the case. So regardless of what we might want from our relationship with China, it also depends on what the Chinese want from the relationship with India. So there is a big question mark out there. The second thing is that given the dynamics of two very large countries like India and China, and the kind of positioning they are looking for in the global system, I think it is bound to be natural that there will be areas of contestation between the two sides. And in a setting where there are very many contentious issues between the two at a bilateral level, when you add the strategic contestation to that framework, then it becomes even more difficult to manage this relationship. To be honest, I think both sides have managed to do reasonably well, notwithstanding what happened at Doklam. The very fact that Doklam did not end up in some kind of a shooting match and better sense prevailed on both sides, they found a via media to disengage from that place, I think goes to the credit of both sides. Now, the fact that both sides can claim victory is all right. It doesn't really matter much. But from my point of view, they've managed this relationship, but I would hope that what has happened today, while the discussions happened today, there would have been greater focus on trying to beef up the kind of border mechanisms which are already in place, to beef them up so much so that these kind of incidents can be prevented in future, and we can even preempt some of these incidents from taking place, because they actually really spoil the mood. And with unrestrained rhetoric coming from the Chinese side, it has enhanced the suspicions and distrust of China in many a Indian mind. When you start challenging India's position in, or start questioning it in Andamans, when you start talking about POK, when you start talking about other areas along the border, then clearly, I don't think any Indian policy maker will be able to rest easy or able to take whatever the Chinese say at face value. So I think those are issues which we also need to look at as we go ahead.
Indeed, indeed. Jabin Jacob, as far as the entire India-China issue itself is concerned, do you believe that there is going to be an offsetting of ties, especially after what has happened between Xi Jinping and Modi? It's all gone on well. The PLA could intervene at some point in time and try and offset that good bilateral that we've had at the highest level, and create another Doklam-like situation somewhere else.
Look, I think we in India should not assume that there are differences between the PLA and their commander-in-chief. We cannot make policy or prepare if we work on that assumption. We should always assume that the orders come from the top, and that all of these is very much part of the as a part of the plan as far as the Chinese are concerned. As far as India-China relations are concerned, you mentioned the word reset. And now this gives the impression that the governments are actively trying to reset the relationship towards a positive direction. But what I would argue is that, starting from the Depsang incident in 2013, the Chumur incident when Xi Jinping visited in 2014, and now Doklam, basically we are headed to a reset that is not necessarily positive. I think India-China relations are entering a very, very difficult stage. And this is this is again, as Mr. Sareen said, this is quite a natural process. There are two large countries with growing and growing capabilities.
So what's the way forward then?
The way forward is really to enhance strategic communications. I think it is not sufficient that just the leaders meet, however regularly they meet. Leaders, the heads of government can only have so much time or so much bandwidth to discuss issues. What we need are more dialogues across teams, across a range of issues between senior officials, middle level officials, and involving junior level officials. I mean, the BRICS, I think, is unique in one of the aspects that they do is bring together junior diplomats to meet with each other. And if you take the relationship between the US and China, for example, look at the number of dialogues that they have. We have nowhere near that number of dialogues. And unless we can enhance the number of dialogues, unless we can enhance the number of exchanges between government officials, between military officials, I think that has been mentioned also at this particular summit, and also between academics and at the people-to-people level. If we do not do that, I think we are in for a very tough time in India-China relations.
Sure. Shubham Bhattacharya, as far as India and China are concerned, do you believe that the nations have learnt a lesson from Doklam? Like one of the other panelists pointed out earlier in the program, no bullets were fired between the two nations, both the armies showed restraint. So is that really how the ties are going to go going ahead? Because at the end of the day, economics should trump the military.
India-China relationships will be a bit of a habit of throwing surprise. So to say that that even though there wasn't any bullets were fired, that it was any less tense is definitely not the case. And whether that would be the format or whether there would be ability to overcome these and set ties on economic matters, I don't think that's possible to separate the two. If you look at Chinese relationship economically with the other countries of South Asia, it's look at the way it has handled relationship with Philippines. And right now, for instance, its economic expansion that it's trying to do in Malaysia, and that's already creating a tension with the ethnic Bhumiputras. So you'd see that Chinese economic involvement with other countries is also an extension of its military involvement. So these sort of things are pretty much clear.
So they go hand in hand as far as the Chinese are concerned.
Considering that the PLA is also a large investor, and it guides the fortunes of quite a few of the companies. So to say that the two would be working separately is obviously definitely not possible. What is going to happen is that I agree that there should be more dialogue between India and China, but China, remember, does not accept India as a strategically equal partner. So to that, or an equal country. So to that extent, while USA and China do have a lot of fields where they do discuss stuff, China does not believe, and at least has not shown much of an inclination to offer that sort of a forum or platform vis-a-vis India.
Right.
BRICS is therefore an interesting avenue which has come up where many of these things could and can be settled down.
Fair enough. Yes, Sushant Sareen, you wanted to say something.
No, just on this business about economic cooperation. I'm all for economic cooperation between countries. I think trade is something between countries which actually enriches all countries, and nobody does a benefit, a favor to the other country by trading with them. So it's a mutually beneficial thing. But I don't think we should overestimate the role of economics also. To some extent, it is true that you develop vested interests and people, if you have a large market like India, which is your 5th largest or 6th largest market, then of course there is also an incentive to not get into a kind of a tiff which could actually completely bust this market apart. So while that is there, at the same time, when you look at China's relationship, for example, with Japan or with Taiwan, and you see the kind of aggressive moves that the Chinese have made, even though their dependence on trade on Japan and Taiwan, as well as on investments with both these countries and also the US for that matter, is a lot more than what it is with India. And yet, that did not stop the Chinese from actually, pushing their weight around in many of the so-called disputes. There was a time when they kept quiet. Today, they think they are in a position that they can actually push ahead with their claims in many of the areas. So I think, it's something which on balance can go either way. This business about economic cooperation between countries. It's not necessarily the magic bullet which will ensure that all will be hunky-dory between any two countries.
Sure. All right. I've got 2 minutes left on the program, so I'm going to quickly try and squeeze in 2 comments from my guests. Ambassador, beginning with you, on the whole, as far as the grouping itself is concerned, what do you believe are the takeaways?
The BRICS, I think, has been able to make some very good statements as far as the global issues are concerned, whether it is climate change or IMF, and so there is a direction in which the 5 countries can go together, and that direction has been very clearly laid out. The accreditation agency and evaluation, our Prime Minister had also spoken about some rating agency,
rating agency, yes.
Solar Alliance,
because
energy.
we can't depend on Western rating agencies.
We can't depend on Western agencies. So as far as that is concerned, that agenda continues, that agenda has been strengthened. And on that direction, I think the BRICS countries will be able to move forward.
And Jabin Jacob, would you call the BRICS 2017 summit a success on the whole?
Well, question of success or failure depends on what our expectations are. And if our foreign ministry declares that, well, expectations have been met, and especially with regard to the declaration of several of these Pakistan-based terrorist groups openly, I think that in that sense, it was definitely a success. I think the issue really going forward is what next. It's not good enough for us to stop having expectations. And, BRICS is actually a very unbalanced grouping. China and India are by far the biggest economic players and also the most significant and equally significant political players. And if the other 3 economies are not able to sort of get their act together, then BRICS really has a problem going forward. So the question is, how do India and China manage to get this entire grouping working together in economic terms as well?
Right. Shubhamai, close the show for us with your concluding remark on whether BRICS will continue to be relevant in the years to come.
BRICS will continue to be relevant, but that we'll have another adventure around India-China tail is something that you can be absolutely sure.
Okay, fine. All right. On that note, then we'll call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. I'd like to thank all my guests on the program, S.R. Tayal, Sushant Sareen, Shubhamoy Bhattacharjee and Jabin Jacob. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. That's all the time we have today. See you again next time.